Okay, everybody, so this is going to be kind of a first attempt at figuring out how we're going to do video lectures for the second half of this class. Let's go ahead and jump straight into Chapter 1. Chapter 1 just kind of is an overview of what penetration testing is and how we're going to approach it and some of the models that you can use when you're thinking about it and why it's important, that kind of stuff. If you're familiar with sort of the way textbooks introduce topics, this is going to be pretty boilerplate, but it's important to have an understanding of this before we try to go farther in the course. We've been talking about pretty much a related topic for most of this class already, but I think probably what you guys have noticed is for the ethical hacking, we've talked a lot about not only how to hack into things, but also how to play defense. A lot of what we've been doing up until this point in the class is talking about how to make sure that your email is encrypted, for example, or make sure that you have ports that are not scannable. We've talked about everything that we've talked about so far has had a sort of a analogous thing that has made it possible for how to think about how to set up your own network securely. Penetration testing is a little bit different than that. What we're going to be thinking about is kind of the skills that people that are out there that might wish to access your data have, the skills that they have and the tools that they have available to them, and sort of look at those two things and say, how would they be able to get into a system? A penetration test, and this is a little bit of this should be familiar from the first half of the class, is a legal and authorized attempt to get into somebody's network, and you generally have a signed agreement saying that this is what you're doing. If you decide that you were going to just go try to hack into, I don't know, Wells Fargo or something like that, and then if you're caught, you explain to law enforcement that no, this was just a penetration test, everything should be fine. That's probably not going to fly. If you're doing something that's a penetration test, it's going to be something that could be not legal unless you had permission to do whatever that thing was that you were doing. So be aware that when we're talking about the difference between penetration tests and, say, hacking, that's going to be one could look like the other if you don't have something in writing from the company that you're doing the penetration test for that's an attempt to sort of explain why you're doing what you're doing. So just in general, let me see if I can get, here we go. When we think about cybersecurity, and this is a model that we didn't see so much in the ethical hacking side of things, but this is important. This is also something that shows up on the Security Plus test. But when we're talking about the goals of cybersecurity, there are three sort of separate things here that are all important. And they are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is referred to as the CIA triad. You'll see that referenced in this book and others. And the reason for that should be fairly obvious. These spell CIA if you look at the first letter of each one of the words. Each one of these means something that's a little bit different. If you have something that's data that's kept confidential, this is a way of sort of explaining that nobody else has been able to access this data. Okay, if you have integrity, this means that if you're that nobody has been able to modify this data in any way. And if you have something that is data that's when we're talking in terms of availability, what we're talking about is that that data can be accessed at any point in time. So you can see how these things would overlap in that you would want all of them to be present if you're doing a good job in terms of security. But you can also see how it would be possible to have two of them implemented but yet a failure on a different one. These aren't necessarily related. And one of the things I'd like you guys to think about is that what it would look like if two of these were working and one of them was not. For example, like if I'm able to keep my data confidential, so I know that only authorized people can get to it, and that I know that it hasn't been modified, so the data has integrity, but it doesn't have availability, meaning the website has gone down, or it's susceptible to, say, distributed denial of service attacks, then I'm only 2/3 the way there, right? Likewise, I could have data that is available all the time if my website has mechanisms in place to protect it from DDoS attacks, for example. And I could make sure that that data is not able to be modified by any bad actors out there. But on the other hand, if I've only done those two things and anybody could get to access that, even if they can't modify it. So we've got integrity, but we don't have confidentiality. Then you've got something that there that is not really meeting all three goals. So these are separate things, and you should be able to know the difference between them, and that is what they are. Now, there's another triad that the book mentions here that it refers to as the DAD triad, and because these start with DAD, disclosure, alteration, and denial. And what you can see here is that the DAD triad is pretty much directly related to the CIA triad. Each one of these things sort of has an analogous thing on the other triad, meaning if data is not, if you're not able to keep it confidential, then it's been disclosed. If you haven't been able to keep data integrity, then that data has been altered in some way. And if that data is not available, then there's some sort of denial of that that's going on. I think something that's probably worth mentioning at this point is that this doesn't just have to do with security, although that's primarily the way that we're talking about it here. It also has to do with just having redundancy and a certain amount of quality with the systems that you're putting together. In other words, my website might be it might have mechanisms to protect itself from people trying to do a denial of service attack, as we mentioned earlier. But if I only have one, if I don't have redundant power supplies on this thing, and the building that it's in loses power, then well, it doesn't really matter that that was wasn't something that was an attempt by a hacker or some sort of bad actor. If there was just a power failure, then that data is just as unavailable as it would be if there was somebody that was actually out there trying to prevent me from getting to it. So same sort of thing. Data integrity could also be threatened by drive corruption, or if you lose data because you're not doing backups. It's the same sort of thing, though. So these are larger goals for security, but really, but also other people that work in IT. So those are the DAD triad and the CIA triad, and that explains how they're related. The textbook here talks about what it refers to as the hacker mindset, and this is a little bit of a different way of approaching security than what we've done in the past. So for the ethical hacking class up until this point, really what we've talked about is kind of a way of looking at security where I'm going to go make sure that I've done everything for a lot of different things that could have gone wrong. For example, I'm worried about physical security. I'm worried about making sure that I have network security. I'm worried about making sure that I'm doing auditing on each individual server, for example. But I'm doing a whole lot of things to make sure that there are no security problems that could crop up anywhere. And that's good and that's important. But when we're looking at the hacker mindset here, the main difference here is that we're not necessarily looking for where the security is strongest. We're looking for where the security is weakest. So if you've adopted the hacker mindset, and you are trying to break into a house, for example, and you go up to the front door and the front door is locked, it's probably going to be easier for you to walk around the back and try the back door and see if that's locked than it would be to say, oh well, I bet there's a way I can get through this. So you're trying to look for the one sort of vulnerable point here. You're not necessarily going and saying, oh well, they've done a pretty good job with this, but let me see if I can get in anyway. That's not the way that most people that are trying to break into a system think. A way of thinking about this is if you have some sort of normal security test, and I've gone through these at work before, where the auditors will come in and check a whole bunch of stuff. They may come back to you and say, hey, looks like you solved all these problems here, and you've done really well. We just found one problem here where passwords are being stored in plain text, for example. So get that fixed. With a pen test, you're going to be you're not necessarily getting credit for the things that you did correctly, because all that you're looking for is a way into the system. So you're attacking at sort of the point that is the most vulnerable, and as a result of this, you're looking. It's a much more focused sort of thing than what we've been talking about earlier. If you're doing a normal way of approaching security, you're going to try to make sure that all the doors are closed and all the windows are locked. With PenTest, you're just looking for the one that somebody may have forgotten about. So that's what that is talking about there. I think probably most of you guys have are familiar with this concept that if you're a lion or you're a gazelle, if you're a gazelle, you've got to be able to outrun every single lion that's out there, and if you're a lion, you just have to be faster than the slowest gazelle. It's the same sort of um, uh, logic here, where if you're doing a pen test, you've only got to get in once. It only has to be something that's momentarily neglected, as opposed to playing defense here, where you've got to be right all the time. So um, there's some benefits to pen testing here, and there's there are three main reasons in the textbooks, and those are that the textbook gives, and those are reflected on this slide right here. It gives us knowledge that we cannot obtain elsewhere. A lot of times, until we try to break in, we don't know if it can be done or not. A blueprint for remediation means that if somebody's able to break into the system or access something that they weren't supposed to be able to get into, remediation is the series of steps that we would take to make that problem go away, to fix things. And if somebody breaks into to your network and you know how they do it, then remediation is the steps that you will go through to close that loophole. And then it also just sort of gives more information about the way attacks might be conducted for in the future. Basically, is those are the benefits that we get from this. Before we go on to PCI DSS requirements, the book has a little sidebar about threat hunting, and threat hunting is a fairly interesting thing here. And the way that you're thinking about threat hunting is a little bit different than the hacker mindset as applied to penetration tests, but it's still pretty similar. And if you were doing threat hunting, what this means is that you were going and looking for after effects of a successful attack on somebody's network. And this doesn't mean that a successful attack has taken place. What this means is that you are saying, well, if this network is hackable, then somebody has probably already hacked it. So I'm going to look for evidence of that and see what I can find. That is what threat hunting is, and it's the approach is what's referred to as the presumption of compromise. So what I'm going to do is stop this video now and pick this up in the next one, just to keep these things from getting too long. So hold tight.